Welcome back. It's that time of year again, and this is a video that I thought about making after Global National interviewed me and all that. It's an odd talking point that I do videos on it, and I mean on some level I want to see a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup, but it doesn't really keep me awake at night that a Canadian team hasn't won a Stanley Cup since 1993. And so the combination of me being interviewed and asked, hey, this is a year it looks like maybe a Canadian team's going to win it. Since then, Winnipeg, nope. Toronto's fighting to stay alive. Edmonton's in the second round. They've still got a chance. Vancouver's up 3-2 on Nashville. But if Vancouver wins that series, it puts them against Edmonton. One will cancel the other out. Whoever it is, doesn't matter. And for Toronto, they'd have to get past Florida in the next round. Good luck. So, that being said, there's the Boston Pizza commercial that gets played every about 10 seconds. I swear it plays during the game. You just get it stuck in your head. Let's all cheer together. So I'll just write up here Boston Pizza. A Canadian owned business, which oddly enough is called Boston Pizza, but I mean, hey, it's fine. Boston's a good Canadian spot, right? So Boston Pizza's Let's All Cheer Together commercial is odd because anytime you have a commercial where everybody's wearing jerseys that don't have logos on them is weird. Like, you know who they're supposed to be, but it's still weird. And it's not the only commercial with that right now up here in Canada where they're wearing jerseys. And I'm like, you know what? If you're not going to have the actual license, and I get it, I totally get it for commercial, um, the jerseys just look weird. They look really, and you guys know the commercials I'm talking about here if you're Canadian. But the idea that, we have to cheer together because they're Canadian teams, I've never really bought into that. And it goes back to the 80s for me. 1988 playoffs, my dad and I having a heated discussion on his fandom of Montreal and my fandom of Toronto, of Boston. And the idea being that I can't cheer for Boston because they're an American team. And my answer was, why can't I? They're still Canadian players. And a majority of the star players I really liked in Boston were born in Canada. Cam Neely, as a for instance. Ray Bourque, as another for instance. Andy Moog, there's another one. Adam Oates eventually played for the team. There's another one. There's a lot of really good Canadian players who play for American teams right now. There's this Nathan McKinnon guy in Colorado who's pretty good. Cale Makar, Canadian. So to me, I've always viewed it more like, okay, these players that are Canadian, that's great. But at the same time, in Vancouver, very often the best players have been Swedish. So again, it's not as simple as, well, it has to be a Canadian team. And I've never really bought into that. Do I want to see a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup? It would be nice to see a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup, sure. But depending on who they're against, I may not be cheering for them against that team. Back in 2006, I've talked about this on the channel before. I'll talk about it again here. I really wanted to cheer for the Oilers in that final series against Carolina. But Carolina had this really good underdog story. And nobody expected Carolina to be there. Plus, I kind of couldn't let go of it as a Canuck fan. I will admit, as a Canuck fan, I was still kind of choked that the Canucks missed the playoffs. The Oilers made it. The Oilers had more, I think it was more overtime loss points that put them over the hump. And I was not happy. So when I see fans complaining about that this year, I think, man, that takes me back 18 years ago. I remember, I know how that feels. I do. I get it. I understand that the Canucks didn't play well enough to make the playoffs in 2006. It didn't make me any less bitter. And so in the Stanley Cup final, when Carolina scored and I cheered, I went, damn, I was trying. I was trying so hard. And so the tribalism that exists in Canada is there. It would be very difficult for a Flames fan, for instance, to cheer for Vancouver. Certain circumstances especially. Same with Oilers. You can't cheer for Vancouver. Winnipeg, maybe. Winnipeg and Vancouver don't have a really nasty relationship, but the Canucks have had their share of battles with both teams from Alberta. I would understand fans of both teams not necessarily cheering for Vancouver. And then you get to Ontario and Toronto and Ottawa, forget it. I don't know that there's that many Ottawa fans to be like, sure, Leafs win the Stanley Cup, that'd be great. Or Leaf fans, if I'd stop laughing. The Ottawa Senators, when they make the playoffs, have had some runs. If the Sens won a Stanley Cup, Toronto fans wouldn't be all that happy because they know they wouldn't hear the end of it. And that's part of the reason, too, why Flames fans, while, if the Oilers do finish this out and win a Stanley Cup in 2024, as a Flames fan, you'd be probably thinking it's nice to see a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup, but now we're never going to hear the end of it. We're never going to hear the end of how we're the Canadian team in Alberta that can't win a Stanley Cup. Great. And then you got Montreal. Montreal, kind of an island, really, honestly, and isn't it an island that they're on? Anyways, technically a continent's just a really big island when you think about it. Don't think about it too hard. But Montreal, do Montreal fans care if Vancouver wins the Stanley Cup? Did they care if Edmonton or Calgary? No. In my experience, Montreal fans, once they're done explaining they have 24 Stanley Cups and not 23, how dare you forget the one they won before the NHL came into existence? But the Montreal fans, I think, are more along the lines of, it'd be great if Montreal won a Stanley Cup. Canuck fans, be great if the Vancouver Canucks won a Stanley Cup. So then, when all the Canadian teams are out, and you don't have to worry about that moral dilemma as a Flames fan of, do I cheer for Edmonton or do I not? When Edmonton's eliminated, you can then go, see, Bettman hates Canada. Bettman hates Canada, that's why. The weird part, though, is that there's always Canadian players who are holding up that Stanley Cup. And very often, whether it's the 2019 St. Louis Blues, last year's Vegas Golden Knights, there's a lot of Canadian players on these teams that win Stanley Cups. Very often, they might be the team that has the most Canadian players. When I was looking up stuff for this video, it appears the Montreal Canadiens, at least to start the season, had the most Canadian-born players of any team in the National Hockey League on their roster, which kind of surprised me a bit, only because Montreal has not been shy about using European forwards and defensemen since the late 80s, early 90s. And I do remember some of the controversy with that, too. The idea that, hey, Montreal should be bringing in preferably players born in Quebec, or at the very least Canadians, and, all this European mix. I don't know if that's going to work. And so that's definitely been a talking point. And it gets talked about across most teams. But it's weird because if you put it the other way around, like if you're a fan of the Tampa Bay Lightning, do you care if Seattle wins the Stanley Cup? No. If it's a Stanley Cup final series and you're a Tampa Bay fan and it's a battle between, say, Florida and Edmonton, aren't you rooting for Edmonton? Aren't you rooting for Edmonton? Because I don't see that. But there is definitely this mentality in Canada that it's still really our game, and we're letting the Americans play it, but we should have the championship. We should have the cup. We are the ones who originated the game. We are the ones, we're it, right? And I don't necessarily agree with that either. I think that every team has an even playing field in theory, and we've talked about how some teams are definitely going to have an advantage over others. But the idea is that every team has a chance to win the cup. And I try to look at every year in isolation. I know I've done videos before on Canadian teams not winning Stanley Cups, and I've gone through each franchise, talked about why they haven't won a Stanley Cup in over 30 years, and it's always led to some arguing. It's always led to some arguing. Or even if I have all these numbers to go, look, this is why these teams haven't won, it's not, some grand conspiracy. The answer is always, yeah, it's just the NHL doesn't want a Canadian team to win. And then that way you can absolve. It's the same as every single game ever in NHL playoff history, somebody will complain about the referees. There is no such thing as a game where people go, you know what was great tonight? The officials. The officiating was great. It's not a thing. Whatever team loses, you can guarantee fans are going to come out and say, that's it. And part of with the Canadian teams not winning, you'll see, you know what? Nope, the officials, the officiating. The team that gets the most power plays should ideally be the one that's controlling the puck the most. And that's usually the case that I've seen when there's a big disparity between who does or doesn't have power plays. And I don't see, because again, it seems to change from one day to the next who the NHL's, I guess, favoring. But in the end, Canadian teams haven't been good enough. And that's the way that I've seen it. But I've always looked at how many Canadian players are on US-based teams. That's why I had no problem cheering for Boston. That was one of my arguments to my own dad. I was like, you know what? Cam Neely, where was he born? Well, I'm born far from here. He's Canadian. He's from British Columbia. Why shouldn't I want to see him win a Stanley Cup? And so, that was part of the argument right there. And the fact that nearly 42% of NHL players are Canadian-born, a number which has dropped. And I understand too the concern over that number dropping. I don't have any concern over the number dropping because we still have amazing players in the National Hockey League from Canada. Canada's fallen behind in goaltending, but Canada's trying to fix that. The problem is it's going to be years before we see the fruits of those labors because it hasn't been focused upon at a junior level and at a level with the kids. So it's really started to affect the number of really good Canadian-born goaltenders we have. Now the really good goaltenders are usually European-born or American. There are some Canadian examples of good NHL goaltenders, but the really great ones right now, it feels like, are usually European-born. So I do think that there's something to be said for wanting to see a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup, but this idea that, we should just cheer for whichever Canadian team's still going and say, you know what, good for them. It's really not a thing. It's really not a thing because while the national pride might be there, the tribalism will take over and it'll be right in the back of your mind. You'll be like, yeah, they should win a Stanley Cup. Screw them. No, they should win a Stanley. No, they should. And so there's that inner battle of I wouldn't mind seeing them win a Stanley Cup, and I'd really rather not. Nope. And it is definitely a conversation that we didn't have to have back in the day because Canadian teams would win Stanley Cups. So we'd still be like, they won a Stanley Cup. Yeah, well, they're jerks. And we'd move on. But it is a conversation to be had. I just don't see a time where all the fan bases are going to say, let's all just imagine if I stood here. Let's just say that Edmonton had lost in the first round against LA. Nashville knocks out Vancouver. Winnipeg knocked out by Colorado. If I stood here in a video and said, let's all rally around the Toronto Maple Leafs and only gave Canadians the right to say whether or not that would be a thing. I don't think 50% would vote yes on that if I made a poll. I don't think the comment section would be, yeah, we should all support the Maple Leafs. I don't think that's how that would work. And same for the Canucks, that if they're the only team standing that I would say all Canadian fans should rally around Vancouver, I would get, that's because you're a stupid Vancouver homer. That's not going to happen. To heck with those guys. And I'm saying it as nice as possible. Same with Edmonton. If I said, let's all rally around Edmonton, especially, let's just say Vancouver knocks out Nashville, Edmonton knocks out Vancouver. If I said, let's all rally around Edmonton, there will be a lot of very upset Canuck fans saying, no. Did you see how the referees favored them that whole series? Forget it. No. Absolutely not. And they cheated. And remember that really bad goal? Yeah, that shouldn't have happened. So, yeah, I don't want them to win a Stanley Cup. Because it's not a Canadian jersey they're wearing. It's a team jersey they're wearing. When they wear a Team Canada jersey, obviously I'd be rooting for Canada because then you are representing the country. Whereas these players are representing a team that happens to be based in Canada. But I mean, I've been to Vancouver many, many times over. I've been to Edmonton twice. I've been through Calgary a couple of times. I've never been to Winnipeg. When I was a toddler, I lived in the Ottawa Valley. I don't think I ever went to the city of Ottawa. I've never been to Toronto, and I've never been to Montreal. I've been to Vegas multiple times. I've been to Anaheim many times. I think the idea of the national border being the deciding factor in who you're rooting for or against, I think it's odd, especially when I don't have an emotional connection to those cities, right? Which I think does make somewhat of a difference. But obviously, in terms of my fandom for Dallas, which goes back to the Minnesota North Stars, with the Boston Bruins, there were other extenuating factors. And, if things had gone differently, sure, I might have grown up a fan of Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. But I didn't. I just didn't. And so if a Stanley Cup final is between, say, Boston and Edmonton, going back to 1990, 1998, that would have been Detroit and Washington. But if it's 1988 and 1990, I'm cheering for Boston. I know Edmonton's a Canadian team. I was still rooting for Boston. And if it happened this year, I'd be rooting for Boston. If Dallas plays Edmonton, I'm rooting for Dallas. And again, it's that I would like to see a Stanley Cup in Canada, yes. The Stanley Cup gets brought to Canada by the Canadian players who win that Stanley Cup with whichever team that wins it. Whether it's Nathan MacKinnon with the Avs, Cale Makar, whether it's Sidney Crosby with the Penguins. like, these guys are Canadian. And so what jersey they're wearing and which city they represent when they're playing on the ice doesn't necessarily have a huge impact for me. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Are you a Canadian fan that says, you know what, I don't care which Canadian team wins it, I want a Canadian team to win it? Or are you of the mind that I want a Canadian team to win a Stanley Cup when it's my Canadian team? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.